Good morning. Can I welcome you to the 6th meeting of the committee in 2014? Can I ask everyone to ensure that all mobile phones and other electronic equipment is switched off, please, including the folks in the public gallery, please. We have an apology today from Stuart McMillan, who is unable to attend today's meeting, but I'd like to welcome Stuart Stevenson as the substitute member. I'd also like to welcome Alec Rowley to his first meeting of the committee. And the first agenda item is to ask you, Alec, if you have any declarations of interest.
Thank you, Convener. I'm still an elected councillor in Fife Council, and I'm also a member of the Fife Council Pension Scheme.
Thank you. And now we move on to agenda item 2, which is our main item of business today, an oral evidence-taking session on the Defective and Dangerous Buildings Recovery of Expenses Scotland Bill. I'd like to welcome our first panel this morning, Derek Mackay, Minister for Local Government and Planning, and Bill Dodds, the Scottish Government Head of Building Standards. Welcome, gentlemen. Minister, would you like to make any opening remarks?
Thank you, Convener. Just a few brief remarks. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me along today to give evidence on Mr Stewart's Defective and Dangerous Buildings Recovery of Expenses Scotland Bill. I believe Mr Stewart has been working on his member's bill over the last 4 years to get it to this stage. Local authorities have a range of powers to deal with buildings that have fallen into disrepair. The current powers in the Building Scotland Act 2003 require them to take action on buildings that they consider to be dangerous. This in some cases may mean undertaking emergency work to secure the building and surrounding area, or carrying out remedial work. Local authorities can also decide to demolish all or part of the building. Local authorities can also take action on defective buildings, and when the owner has not carried out the necessary remedial works, undertake the works for themselves. These powers cover all building types and, while important to ensure the safety of people in and outside the buildings, help protect buildings for the future. At the moment, when local authorities need to carry out such work themselves, they can recover their costs from the building owner through normal debt recovery methods. Unfortunately, this has not always been successful. This work by local authorities is at the core of protecting the existing built environment, but requires local authorities to invest their time and resources. The Scottish Government therefore acknowledges that the cost recovery aspect of the legislation should be improved. I believe that linking local authority costs to the property would be a welcome improvement, which in turn would give local authorities more certainty of getting their expenses back.
Thank you very much for that, Minister. I think many of us round the table at one point or another have had dealings with such buildings. There was numerous discussions last week in the evidence-taking session round about the length of time that folk could pay back, and 30 years was the suggestion by Mr Stewart. Do you have any view in terms of timescales as set out in the bill?
I think timescales is a good question. I think the 30-year period, if that was the standard, would be too rigid for every circumstance. So I think greater flexibility and options around that would be very welcome. Of course, the nature of some of the repairs might not warrant a payback period of some 30 years. So I think greater flexibility should be considered at this stage. I think it would be prudent, Convener, to inform the committee in discussions I've had with the member, and I'll have further discussions with other government colleagues, is that we are minded to support the bill. I was progressing work through the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill, because these powers, having been removed, frankly, I think was something of a mistake. So improving the powers and restoring that which was already there and making them better to reflect circumstances is something we should support. Mr Stewart's bill is ahead of the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill, and for timing reasons, if Mr Stewart can accommodate some of the amendments we would suggest, then Government is quite content to support that, and I thought it was important to share that with the committee at the outset.
I think that's very useful, Minister. There was also a discussion last week round about bringing this in and having some retrospective actions. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that aspect.
Well, there will be a great number of legacy cases where local authorities have taken action and debt is outstanding. That said, we'd want to make sure that we were compliant with European and domestic legislation. There may be issues around introducing legislation and that being retrospective. We will be doing further work on that. We'll deal with the member in terms of what can be accommodated in the bill As I say, there may be some legal and technical issues as to why it can't be retrospective in terms of monies owed, but certainly once the bill is in place, it would be implemented at that point. But we're continuing to explore that with solicitors as to whether it would be competent to have any retrospective function.
Thank you. We heard also last week from representatives of housing associations about difficulties that they have experienced in terms of cost recovery, and Mr Stewart indicated that he was quite sympathetic to what they had to say. Can I ask you for your views on how we can help housing associations and the difficulties that they often face in terms of cost recovery?
Well, of course, this bill is quite narrow in respect to dangerous and defective buildings, and so if a housing association property was in such a position, you'd expect the housing association to be proactive in any event. But it wouldn't negate the powers that local authority would have to take action. What the bill is not, though, is a wider factoring bill. That's a completely separate issue. I'm not saying it's not important. This is quite a narrow and specific bill, focusing specifically on dangerous and defective buildings. And irrespective of that ownership issue, the local authority would be able to take action.
Thank you. I think the difficulty that arises with the housing associations is where they own a certain amount of properties in a building, sometimes not even, well, not the majority shareholding, and then have the difficulty of cost recovery. And there was discussion between the groups that were here about how the councils could cooperate with the housing associations, and I just wondered if there were any specific views that you had in that.
I mean, I think Housing Minister and other colleagues, and Rosanna Cunningham, in terms of property law ministerial responsibility, might want to explore that further. But good proactivity on debt management and commissioning of work in terms of the existing legislation around factoring and ownership. We would want to be proactive on that, separate to this bill, which is focused on defective and dangerous buildings, not all aspects of tenemental property, shared property, liability notices and so on, or factoring itself. So we're sympathetic to some of the challenges that housing associations have. But in terms of the purpose of this bill, it's much more narrow. That said, of course, if housing associations have property in a building that is dangerous and defective, they will benefit from this legislation in empowering local authorities to be able to recover the costs. And I think that in itself will incentivise local authorities in their building standards function to take action where they may have been a bit more nervous to do so before.
Thank you, Minister. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Convener. Let me just preface my couple of short questions by the case which drives me to this, which is in a particular village in the northeast of Scotland where there's a derelict building on the main street of the village. The ownership of the building was initially quite uncertain. After 5 years' work, we found that it was owned by a registered company in Panama who would only deal with us in the community by correspondence in Spanish. So it cost a lot of money to deal with them, quite obviously for translations, etc. But the question that case leads me to, in the first instance, is there anything in what's proposed that helps us deal with remote and inaccessible and perhaps de facto unfindable owners, where there is no owner who is ever, in practical terms, going to cough up any money whatsoever? That's the first question. And linked to that, the second question is, given that this particular building is approaching the point where it's a clear site with some stones lying on it, would it apply to such a state of dereliction? There might be a debate as to whether there's a property there or not.
I'd want to be careful not to trespass into areas I'm not quite as familiar with, such as property law, whereas I understand there's some legislation around if a property is abandoned, untouched and unchallenged, there's no existing title. If someone takes occupation unchallenged for a period of time, they might well acquire those rights. So that may be a way forward for Mr Stephen to expand his property portfolio in some parts of Scotland. It's not for me to advise the member, of course, but in terms, in all seriousness, of titles, I think In addition to the normal routes of debt recovery, which we would still encourage local authorities to pursue, of course, but where there's a title, attaching the debt and that cost, that liability to the title, seems like a sensible way forward. An incentive for the owner, where we have one, to certainly pay their share and to take action, and indeed take earlier action, avoid the local authority having to move in the first place. There's an issue, I suppose, around definitions of dangerous and defective property, but I think because local authorities already have the power, are already carrying out these functions to a great extent, we know how to tackle this. But what we're trying to create is a culture of proactivity where even if there's a lack of an owner, that local authority can take action, because in more cases than not there will be an identifiable owner. And as I say from my earlier more flippant remarks, if there is no title and there is no owner or no identifiable owner, then we can, I suppose, adopt a different approach.
I believe that the Minister is referring to something which, and my memory is imperfect on this, the vacanta provisions. Yes, I'm getting a nod from your officials, I must be right. But it does require occupation for a period of 10 years, which is not terribly easy for many of our communities. So I merely say that to inform. Thank you.
Minister, obviously we have heard previously, and some of us have experienced situations where a building has changed hands on numerous occasions in very short amounts of time. Do you think that this proposal actually halts that kind of practice and should lead to a better chance of cost recovery with it going to title?
I think it's a good question. In terms of occupancy, the tenant may change, the occupant may change, but if the owner changes of the property, then that must be reflected in the title. And therefore, by attaching the debt to the title, as a last resort, then I think that feels like a pretty strong safeguard, even if there is a very frequent turnover of ownership of the property.
Stuart Stevenson again, please.
While the Minister, I understand what he's saying, of course, one of the difficulties with corporate ownership is it not, Minister, is that the ownership of the corporate body that owns the property is what changes, rather than a change in the registration of the property, and that it is that indirect but de facto ownership that causes many of the difficulties in many parts of Scotland, but particularly in the North East of Scotland, where actually you have the further complication of leaseholding of the land upon which properties may reside, and therefore the rights of the leaseholder may preempt the rights of the owner. So I suspect the Minister might tell us that this is a very substantially more difficult issue than is being dealt with in this bill.
It's unlike Mr Stevenson to ask a difficult question, it really is, but I would say that we're in a far better position to have these proposed new powers, which are very similar to that which I was proposing in the Community Empowerment Bill, and very similar to that which we had before, which is an improvement on simple methods of debt recovery for previous work carried out. So I do believe it's an improvement. Will it resolve every single case? Unfortunately, no, I don't think it will, but if there are any other mechanisms that could improve it, then we're certainly interested, but I think it's a step forward compared to the step back, which is maybe what we lost when these powers were inadvertently removed.
Thank you. John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. I wouldn't joke too much about the raiders of lost titles. It has caused many problems in many areas, in my area particularly, where we did have somebody who went through the records and identified pieces of land that had no title claim and then took them on ownership and then sold them off. So it does cause problems. So we have to be careful about the raiders of lost titles. Minister, last week in evidence we heard from SFHA that they were asking for the same powers as being conferred within the proposed bill for charging orders powers. What would be your view about extending the scope of organisations that could actually be empowered to make charging orders? Minister?
Again, in terms of this bill, it relates to defective and dangerous buildings. Now, if the member wants to widen it out from that, then that will have ramifications. Now, the government's happy to explore that, but at the moment this is specifically in terms of dangerous and defective buildings. If we want to introduce charging orders for other matters, and then we would give that some thought. So it's not a known principle, but this is a fairly tight bill for good reason. It hasn't been progressed before, and then two bills come along at once, and government, as gracious as we are, supporting the member and taking his bill forward. So we're happy to explore that, but it would have to be in the context of dangerous and defective buildings.
So this was in respect to dangerous and defective buildings, because the argument that came forward from SFHA was that when their members are dealing with properties and trying to carry out remedial work, then they find it very difficult. What they expressed was a view that they had the same problem trying to identify owners, particularly in tenemental properties, where they had to deal with defects in the building, that they felt that they were then having to carry out the work, but without the powers they could then pursue in the same way as a local authority could the recovery of those costs. And it was just that the argument was that if they had the same powers, then they would be able to pursue the owners of those properties for any costs attributed in terms of making good the defects in the building.
Well, it remains a local authority power at the moment because of the current functions that local authorities have in terms of public safety and the building standards function that we execute in partnership with local authorities. We don't have proposals to change that, although of course there's work going on in the housing bill at the moment as well, which looks more widely at some of the ownership issues. I'm just very mindful that this bill is focused on dangerous and defective buildings. It's not intended, it wasn't intended to look at the wider issues of ownership and factoring and general improvements, which of course we'd want to encourage across Scotland, but on a very tight framework. So, government's not opposed to exploring it, but it's really a matter for the member, and I would refer Mr Wilson to the housing bill that will make its way through Parliament as well.
I accept that, Minister. It's just a crossover in terms of some of the powers that are being requested and some of the recovery of costs from other organisations other than the local authority. And one of the issues that also arose last week was the average cost. Now, we were given a figure by particularly the local authority representatives that came before us last week, that they said the average cost of making safe a building was £3,000. Now, if we are talking about, and we also heard an extreme example where in North Lanarkshire, one of the witnesses alluded to a £70,000 cost to make secure a building. But is it the intention of the government, and we'll speak to the member who's promoting this bill later, is it the intention of the government just to make safe buildings, or is it the intention of the government to try and ensure that we bring buildings into full use or back into full use?
The purpose of the bill and the purpose of the existing legislation around defective and dangerous is to bring it back into a safe condition. So, for example, I'll give you an example. It's a constituency example, and I hope this is right. I'm sure Bill will correct me if I get this wrong, but a corner building in the constituency I represent, tenement, mixed ownership, had been neglected. The stonework was coming off. It was clearly a threat to the surrounding public. Orders were issued. No action was taken. The local authority carries out the work to make safe the property. It might not make the flats within the building habitable, but it made the building safe, and it kept the public safe from falling masonry. Now, what was missing then was the ability to then attach cost to ensure that the costs were returned to the council. So, no is the answer to your question. It's not about bringing all property up to a standard of occupation. It's to make them safe and comply with the existing legislation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister.
Alec Rowley, please.
Thanks, and good morning, Minister. The first meeting consensus has broken out. Hopefully that's the way we move forward. But I certainly think that local authorities across the country will be will be welcoming the fact that you're minded to support this bill and take it forward. I know that for experience in Fife, trying to recover some of the monies where the council has taken action has been really difficult. And indeed, to the point where local authorities would be very reluctant, it would have to be absolutely convinced that it was really dangerous, and that's often left members of the public rather baffled as to what constitutes being dangerous or defective. And I suppose that would lead to my other question, which is that while I welcome this and want to see it happen, the funding involved, and I think Fife, I mean, the local authorities have responded to Dave Stewart's bill fairly positively, but one of the questions that Fife raises is the funding itself. And, as you know better than most, local authorities don't have masses of capital or revenue that's just sitting there waiting on a dangerous building coming along. And therefore, one of the suggestions that has come forward from Fife is to explore the options around funding and whether, for example, a national loan fund is something that local authorities could tap into to be able to access funding. So is that something that you're prepared to look further at in terms of funding?
I'd like to welcome Mr Rowley to Parliament. Of course, experience is one of the budget process, and now this bill where the Labour Party and the SNP work so closely together. That's the norm in the Scottish Parliament. We very rarely detract from that position. Just like Fife Council, I dare to say. But in all seriousness, actually the way this bill has progressed has been consensual, because everyone recognises an issue, wants to tackle it. We've had slightly different nuances in how we approach it. Finance is an issue. Finance is at the heart of this, where local authorities should be able to recoup the expenditure, of course, of taking out this very necessary work. We're not attracted, though, as a government, and this is Mr Stewart's bill, but we're not attracted to create a new ring-fence pot of money that local authorities could then draw upon, for the reason is you're well aware that government has tried to reduce ring-fence pots of money to local government to the point where we've reduced ring-fencing from a substantial figure of over £2 billion to less than around £200 million. And if we were to create a specific fund, then really it would be a form, I suppose, of ring-fencing, re-ring-fencing local authority resources that is not the road that we would choose to go down. In terms of capital costs, there are pressures. Of course there are, as a consequence of the Westminster reductions to Scotland. But that said, local authorities, local government share of the pot has largely been maintained, and specifically in terms of capital, the resources are there. And only just a few weeks ago we approved over £10 billion to local authorities. So I'm not saying local authorities aren't under pressure, they are, like the rest of us, but I do believe there are resources there to be able to tackle this should the bill progress. What I think is fair comment is that with these powers, with maybe the expectation and the profile of the local authorities' power being raised, maybe there will be greater demand in this. But again, that would be for local authorities to prioritise and to choose how much priority it was for them and how much of their capital resources they would wish to make available.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Mark MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Convener. A couple of questions. At the last evidence session, there was discussion around the repayment period and the 30-year repayment period, and the view was taken by the witnesses that rather than this being a 30-year repayment period, it should be a period of up to 30 years to allow flexibility for local authorities, particularly in cases where they might be gathering a fairly small sum of money, to avoid having that spread out over a long period of time. Does the government have a position on the repayment period?
Yes, we would, and we would concur with those comments that 30 years feels, if it was a standard, if it was the norm, the expectation, and it is too rigid, and it should be far more flexible, so that local authorities can deploy which financial mechanism they want to use to recoup costs, and then within that have a degree of flexibility. In terms of supporting the bill, there are a few areas that government have highlighted to Mr Stewart that we would want to address, and that's one of them, that we think there should be greater flexibility for the reasons that Mr MacDonald has given.
Another point which was raised, and I know that Mr Stewart has taken awareness of this, is where there may be a conflict between a defective and dangerous building and a building that is listed or has heritage status. Does the government have a view on how that potential conflict might be overcome?
I'm happy to explore that further, and what I've asked Building Standards Division colleagues to do is support Mr Stewart. So if there are any issues there, then we'd want them to be resolved before the end of the bill, and if that requires amendment, then we'll certainly assist in doing that. But I'm sure if there's any conflict, we'll explore that and then assist to resolve it, if there is one.
Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. I think all my questions have nearly been asked, but anyway, greater flexibility. Minister, you mentioned there about the 30-year period. That would be one of the amendments, shall we say, that you would want to see in the bill. Can you describe some of the other?
Yep. Certainly, I think that the 30-year, the flexibility is one area that we would want to address in terms of repayment being flexible. Some of the areas we would want to address include the time between the local authority incurring the expenditure and the registration period as well, so that local authorities can move more quickly and register, keep the time delay at an absolute minimum, so that people can't use time as a reason for not being able to use the notice. We would also want a bit more work to be considered on the appeals mechanism as well. I'm not attracted as a minister to an appeals mechanism where government or reporters are making a determination or a decision around the costs. You know, there's a suggestion there might be an appeals mechanism. So I think we need further work on that, and exploring a bit more whether some of these provisions could apply to all enforcement powers under the Building Scotland Act, and not just defective and dangerous buildings, are areas that we would want to explore in good time for stage 2 and 3.
Anne?
Good. No, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Minister.
Okay, Minister. I'd like to thank you for your evidence this morning, and I suspend for a few minutes for a change of witnesses. Thank you. Okay. We now move on to this morning's second panel. I'd like to welcome David Stewart, MSP, the member in charge of the bill, Claire Mingus-Smith, Senior Assistant Clerk, Non-Government Bills Unit of the Scottish Parliament, and Neil Ross, Principal Legal Officer at the Scottish Parliament. Welcome to you all. Good morning. Mr Stewart, would you like to make any opening remarks?
If I could, Convener, I appreciate I put some technical points on the official record. Convener and members, first of all, could I thank you for inviting me to give evidence this morning on the bill. As you know, it's been a long and windy road since my friend Councillor Jimmy Gray, who's the convener of the Highland Council, asked me to take action over dangerous buildings nearly 4 years ago. But I think one of the great strengths of this Parliament is the Members' Bill procedure. It does allow ordinary members the opportunity to make a difference in policy areas of their choice. And I'd like to place on record my thanks to all the officials in the Non-Government Bills Unit, Legal Services and the legislative drafting teams for their help. Of course, Convener, any errors are my responsibility and my responsibility alone. But as you'll be aware, I've been working towards this point since last session, when I consulted on my initial much wider proposal, which included areas such as building MOTs, but also, importantly, charging orders. Now, many local authorities, as you know, Convener, responded to my consultation, and over 80% expressed support. And as I said to the committee back in 2012, my view is that a bill stands the best chance of success if it is measured and focused and the member is prepared to be flexible and adaptable. Although I could not go as far as perhaps I would have ideally liked, I believe the bill before you today has the potential to make a significant difference to local authorities. But of course, it is not a magic bullet to cure all ills. Now, charging orders, as you will well know, will give local authorities greater flexibility and discretion about how to recover their costs when they've carried out work on defective and dangerous buildings under Section 28, 29 and 30 of the Building Scotland Act 2003. It will also increase the proportion of these costs recovered. It's important to note that the problem I seek to address applies more widely than just residential properties. It extends to buildings more generally, including commercial, farming and historic properties. That is why it is essential that local authorities have access once more to the mechanism of charging orders, to deal with the varied circumstances of owners and the different types of buildings dealt with under the 2003 Act. And members will know that charging orders relate back to 1959, where they've been a well-trusted, tried and tested technique. But to put the bill in context, according to the Scottish Housing Conditions Survey in 2011, 83% of Scotland's dwellings were in some state of disrepair. But more worryingly, 48% were in an urgent state of disrepair. And another indicator of disrepair in Scotland's built environment is the number of notices issued in relation to defective or dangerous buildings, which stands at 212 for dangerous and 206 for defective during 2011-12. But action without notice, which, as members will know, is the most urgent action, has more than doubled, from 402 in 2010-11 to 992 in 11-12. And sadly, these figures do not demonstrate an improving picture. Instead, they signal an increasing burden on local authorities. The Scottish Government Research Project worked, and I quote, to identify a cost recovery mechanism for local authorities dealing with dangerous and defective buildings, and quote, in November 2012, collected information from 8 local authorities. The project estimated the total unpaid debt for these authorities amounted to 1.5 million. This figure, when roughly extrapolated, produces an estimated all-Scotland figure of 3.9 million. Now, it's unclear, Convener, how much local authorities have had to completely write off, but in my extensive contact with building standards managers across the whole of Scotland, I've picked up the estimated figure is around 700,000 since 2005. Now, the research also showed that local authorities currently collect around 50% of their costs. This cannot be a satisfactory outcome for any local authority, particularly when they have a statutory duty to act, as is in the case with dangerous buildings. So I firmly believe my bill will strengthen local authorities' cost recovery position. And I would also make it clear, Convener, that the power to make a charging order is discretionary. Charging orders will be appropriate in some cases and not in others. The local authority is, of course, best placed to take this decision in light of the facts and the circumstances of each and every individual case. Now, I have listened, Convener, to the local authorities' views about the 30-year term of a charging order being too long, for example, the outstanding sum is small. That is why I intend to bring forward an amendment to give local authorities greater control over setting the term of their charging order. One of the main advantages of registering a charging order against the title of the property has to be that if the property is sold, then the local authority should be repaid through the proceeds of the sale. Additionally, as the order is secured against the property, this avoids the need to pursue an individual through the civil courts. That can be the case at present when an authority might have to take court action to recover the sums due to it in the absence of being able to rely upon a charging order. This can be both time-consuming and costly, and depending on the sums involved and whether the owner can be traced in the first place, may not be a viable option. But the upfront cost of registering a charging order is very low. It's likely to be in the region of £50, thereby not adding to local authorities' burden of costs. And of course, even the £50 could be added to the charging order itself, along with any administrative costs. So charging order also benefit these owners who cannot access funding because of their low incomes. A charging order allows them to pay by instalments over a manageable term. And if during this time an owner's financial circumstances improve, then the bill provides for an early settlement of the repayment amount or some lower amount if agreed by the local authority. Some responses to the Finance Committee and Local Government and Regeneration Committee raised an issue about whether there may be circumstances under the bill where a property could be sold or transferred before a charging order could be registered. Now, of course, local authorities are the expert in this area, and as such, I hope they will welcome the news that I intend to bring forward an amendment to provide a mechanism that will enable local authorities to register liability for costs without having to specify the costs at the time, taking account of the precedent suggested by local authorities under the Tenements Act of 2004, thus further safeguarding the local authority's position. I'd also, Convener, take the opportunity to confirm that I'm going to amend the bill at stage 2 to take account of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee's suggestion that the Scottish Minister should be able to directly amend Schedule 5 to alter the form and content of the charging order, rather than that being the prospect of this being amended by way of subordinate legislation. Now, this brings me on to the amicable discussions I've had with the Minister for Local Government, Derek Mackay, and his officials. It's always been accepted that the Scottish Government and I share the same goal, to improve local authorities' ability to recover their costs. We have, however, had slightly different approaches as how to address the problem. And I'd like to thank the Minister for recognising this is a non-contentious and non-political subject area where agreement and consensus working is the key to resolving the plight of local authorities timelessly. And I hope the Minister and the Committee will be reassured by my commitment to make these important changes to the bill, not just to meet the needs of local authorities, but to resolve any concerns that the Scottish Government may have about the approach taken in my bill. Now, I acknowledge the Scottish Government's further observation in its memorandum, which I saw late yesterday afternoon, on C, the debts incurred prior to implementation, D, the details of the appeal mechanism, and E, extending the bill to compliance and enforcement provisions on Part 3 of the 2003 Act. I'm content to work with the Scottish Government to explore the detail of what would be involved and how best these matters could be addressed within the bill. And I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I'm glad to hear that there is cooperation between yourself and the government, and that you are flexible, as you said in those opening remarks. Mr Stewart, first of all, in terms of your letter to the committee, you do touch upon extending charging orders to social landlords, and you say that that is not within the scope of your proposed bill. Would you like to add to that, please?
Sure. Well, first of all, I appreciate the committee inviting me along last week, and I thought it was very good evidence from Susan Torrance. I'm very sympathetic to the position that housing associations are in. I think what I had to do, Convener, was look very carefully at a number of things. First of all, obviously this is not a government bill where clearly there would be a much wider range of solutions and a wider range of tools to help local authorities and others. And because I hadn't consulted specifically on this, I felt the best way forward to have a very specific, simple, straightforward solution. And that's why I focused on charging orders for dangerous and defective. Notwithstanding that, I think the Minister's made some very interesting points earlier, and I'm happy to incorporate these suggestions. My own feeling in the letter was that if there could be some internal arrangements between local authorities and housing associations to resolve the problems that Susan Torrance raised last week, I'd be more than happy to do that. However, I just feel this is beyond the competence of the bill. And the other issue is I didn't want to make the bill over-elaborate or open up effectively other fronts that may cause criticism by people who said, well, you did not consult on this issue, therefore it's not competent for you to take this forward. So hopefully that gives you a clear answer to why I feel it's beyond the terms of the bill. However, clearly, if government wished to add an amendment to stage 2, clearly I would look at that in great detail.
Thank you. You also comment on the evidence written and oral by Dave Sutton of the IHBC, who indicated, I think, a willingness to extend the remit of the bill. You say that in your letter that while you're sympathetic, you don't think this is the way forward. Would you like to comment on that?
Again, well, I thought Mr Sutton's evidence was excellent. I think I'm sure the committee would agree it was a very comprehensive set of evidence. He had some very good technical approaches about the problems we face across Scotland, and I didn't disagree with his evidence in any way. Again, I just feel most of what he was suggesting last week was well out with the frame of what my bill was trying to achieve. So that was the only issue I had around the evidence and the suggestions, is I just don't think technically it's possible to expand my bill. I mean, clearly if it was a bill starting from scratch from the Minister, it may well be you could incorporate all these extra difficulties and issues that have been raised in consultation. But I think my advice I've been given as an ordinary member is I've got to keep it pretty specific and pretty much in terms of what the consultation touched on. So for these reasons, I didn't feel I could extend the bill, Convener.
If you were to extend the bill to include historic buildings with some heritage.
Yeah,
Do you think that that would maybe have some conflict with some other existing legislation?
Well, my understanding, and Neil Ross can keep me right on this, is that the bill will apply under the 2003 Act to all buildings, including farming, including commercial and residential and historic. But as you rightly say, there's quite a lot of legislation about already on historic and listed buildings, and it may be you get some sort of conflict between new legislation and existing legislation. But that wasn't something I've consulted on, and it's not something I think I can incorporate within the bill, sadly. Clearly, I would like to provide a lot more solutions than I'm currently doing. But again, I would go back to my original point. This is a members' bill, and it's not possible to include things that are clearly out of the frame of the original concept of the bill.
So your argument is that you have focused on the areas that have been brought to your attention, and you don't want to muddy the waters in terms of maybe coming into conflict with other pieces of legislation.
That's correct. I mean, the caveat that I would make is that the issues that the Minister have raised are a logical extension of the bill in some ways and are still within dangerous and defective. And there are some issues to do with the bill, like the length of the charging order and so on. So I'm quite comfortable with the points that the Minister has raised, and I'm glad that he's offered the support of his officials as well. And obviously I'll work with them over any government amendments on the ones he's touched on earlier. But beyond that, I have no intentions of moving further amendments that are out of the frame of the bill. Clearly, if Scottish Government wants to amend at stage 2, I'll take advice from officials here for the next step, but I wouldn't be looking to extend it to the ways you're describing earlier.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson, please.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I just wanted to pick up what Mr Stewart has said about prior ranking in his note to the committee. And given that organisations who have a standard security over properties will generally place upon the borrower duties to maintain buildings to standards and thereby ensure they have an asset that's worth something, is there any mechanism that perhaps the member in charge or the government, for that matter, could consider that when and if the holder of a standard security gets their money back, some of that is entailed to go to the local authority who may be out of pocket and who thereby has protected the value that's attributable to the holder of the standard security? Because while I understand the very substantial complexities there are around the whole issue of looking at placing the local government order at a higher ranking than that of standard securities, and potential legal challenges there might be if we attempted to do it in that way, I do feel where public money is being spent to protect the interests that are essentially private or corporate, I'd like to be confident that we've explored every opportunity to make sure the public purse gets back the money it's spent in these circumstances.
Thank you. I think that's a very good point. I know Mr Stevenson spent many years in banking, has a lot of expertise in this. A couple of points on that. The members will know that the original 1959 Act did actually provide for prior ranking in the original legislation. And I looked very carefully at this because clearly local authorities are very keen on this, because prior ranking means they're further up the pecking order than perhaps your building society or your bank loan. I mean, what I had to do was look at a couple of things. First of all, some of the legal advice I got was you have to be quite careful with the European Convention of Human Rights considerations on this. But I'll give you an example. Let's assume that there is a charging order on a property and there's collateral on the property, so it's a £200,000 property, there's £100,000 worth of a building society loan, and there's no other securities. Any work done by the council would be attached to the title. Therefore, there would be plenty of collateral within that situation for the council to get their money back. That's the beauty of the charging order. Although it's taken over a 30-year period, many properties, as you know, are sold within that period, and normally you would expect the new owner to have a clean title, in other words, the charging order discharged and paid back to local authority. So in most cases, Mr Stevenson, and that's why there's a beauty about the charging order, the one caveat I would give you from my experience talking to local authorities across the country is that judgments about whether you have a charging order or not are normally made between the building control expert who's been carrying out the work and the legal team. So if there is a clean title and there's collateral in the building, because you can get that in any searches, you would normally expect a charging order to be used. If that's not the case, legal would normally advise the officers not to go ahead with the charging order. So that's the key point. So I'm not going for prior ranking. In most occasions, when you're doing your proper preparation, a charging order will work well, because although it doesn't rank as high as your building society, your bank security, that may well be the only other security after that. So this is done purely on date of recording. I don't know if Mr Ross wants to come in on any legal side.
That is the position. It ranks according to registration, according to the point of registration.
Well, perhaps, and you may not know the answer, but it might be good to put the question on the record. Given that the charging order will be attached to the title and therefore registrars of Scotland will be aware of it and anyone doing searches will see it, would there be notice given to the institution that placed the charging order if there is if the disposal is contemplated of this property, so that such interests as the council may have can be protected at the point where there might be some financial value to the asset?
Keenan, if I could I get Mr Ross to answer that? Okay.
Yes, I'm not sure whether you're indicating that the Registrars of Scotland should have some active role in terms of intimating.
Can I just be clear? I'm merely posing a question without having a predetermined answer to the question. It's simply where you can get, as you'll be well aware, a very complicated set of interests registered against title, some financial and some of other character. But the important thing is where there's a financial interest, such as a charging order, that becomes capable of delivering money back to the council at the point where there's some value realised by the sale of the property concerned or transferred to another person. And I simply was wondering if it's possible, and it may be out with the scope of this bill, I accept, for the local council to be advised that the property is about to be sold. Because clearly the purchaser will be aware of the charging order, but there isn't necessarily an obligation on the purchaser to do anything about that.
I think that's a very interesting point. I hadn't actually considered that, Mr Stevenson, but what we'll do, if we can take this away and look into this and perhaps drop you a line back, and if necessary, if there's any need for amendments, we'll certainly take that on board at stage 2.
With the convener's consent, I think it would be the committee you might wish to write to. I'm merely...
That would be extremely useful, Mr Stewart, if that were possible, if you could drop us a note after exploring that issue. Cameron Buchanan, please.
Good morning. So far you've been commenting mostly on town and city areas. I was going to what's your policy on rural areas where barns and buildings are defective but not actually threatening anybody unless they're by the roadside? What is your opinion on that?
Well, I think it's a good point, Mr Buchanan. Obviously, coming from the Highlands and Islands, I've got an eye to rural areas and farmland as well. I think the main thing I would really ask the committee to look at, and the committee will be familiar with this, is that apart from the cost recovery power, I'm not really touching the dangers of defective building legislation. So all it's doing is adding an extra tool to the armoury of local authorities who have incurred costs in any dangerous or defective building. Now, that can be, a residential property, it can be commercial, it can be a farm building, it can be a historic building, it can be a listed building. So all the legislation on 2003 is still there. All I'm doing is giving them an extra tool to get their funds back that they've already incurred. So if a council in, say, Highland Council area has spent money making sure that a farm building is made safe, or some work around defective buildings, and they're unable to get the funds back from the owner, or by cooperation they feel charging order is better, they can use a charging order for a farm building exactly the same as in a city building in Edinburgh or in Glasgow. So there's no difference at all to using the charging order. It doesn't matter if it's rural or urban, agriculture or historic.
But very often these sort of the titles are very vague in rural areas and maybe have no titles at all. So I wonder what happens to them, if you can't find out who owns the actual property.
Back to my reply to Mr Stevenson, they are not compulsory for local authorities to use. The point I would make, Mr Buchanan, is that this has got to be a judgment by the people who are best placed to do this, who are the legal and building control teams at each of your local authorities and 32 authorities across Scotland. It's these individuals who will make that judgment. Some of the judgment, most of the time, of course, it's the owner's liability, and nothing in the bill suggesting other than that. Most of the time, local authorities get funds back from the owner. Some of the time, either you get owners who don't pay or won't pay. You cannot use normal cost recovery procedure, and as you well know, I think the average is 5,000, Mr. Roth, to get on legal costs. Getting costs back through civil cost recovery is not always successful. If there's a clean title and a distinct title, then there would be advice, I would suggest, to use a charging order. So in the example you've given me, if there's any doubt about the title, don't use a charging order. That's my advice.
One more. You mentioned about the register, the liability for costs. What sort of register would you have for costs? If, you know, not just ranking, but people who've put in, who've repaired the building and made it good and safe, and other people who've done more to it?
Yes, well, perhaps I can say a wider issue through your convener on that. The key point, I think, is that any legitimate costs that a local authority have can be added to the charging order. So the first point is, of course, the £50 or thereabouts. It's quick if you do it by internet. It's cheaper. It's very cheap to do, and you don't go to courts, just through the land register. Any administrative costs that you've had in setting up charging order, obviously your costs in terms of your building control work, on a lot of occasions it's the private sector that are carrying out these repairs and then charging the council. But whatever your costs are, and there's a whole list in the bill which outlines them. So administrative, financial, legal, costs of time of the staff, and obviously there's ways of allocating these costs in the standard way. You would then add that to the total cost of the charging order, and then that is set for the required time. As I've hinted earlier, for larger sums, it's probably liable to be still a longer period. For smaller sums, like 5,000 or 6,000, you won't be wanting to wait 30 years. Clearly, you need to have a short time period. But the council should not be out of pocket. So the technical term, I think, is you would have a full cost recovery approach to this, which is staff time, actual costs, and cost of repair. That's how you get it.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Alec Rowley, please.
Thank you, Convener. And good morning, David. And congratulations on all the hard work that you've obviously done to get the bill to the stage. It certainly seems to be welcomed by local authorities, although they have raised concerns, particularly around the proposal for the inclusion of the appeal process. Could you maybe say something about that? Because there is a view that it could be used by people to try and avoid.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. I'm glad, Mr. Riley, I've got an opportunity to raise that. I spoke actually to one of my Highland Building Control officers earlier on, just to run through the actual day-to-day procedure. And perhaps I could just say a slightly longer answer just to explain where the appeal comes in. In the normal course of events, if there's a dangerous building, councils will go immediately to the owners, and most of the time it's in the owner's interest, obviously, to do the work informally, with no requirement to have any orders of any sort. If the individual doesn't want to do that, then they can set a dangerous building notice. They don't need to court for that. They have powers, officers have powers to go and do that action. So that will be immediate health and safety, make sure Main Street's not falling, make sure the road's closed, all emergency work. Where the owner at that stage says, no, I don't think the work should be done, because it might be £10,000. Secondly, I don't think it's apportioned correctly. You can then go to the Sheriff Court and appeal at that stage. Now, that's an existing appeal within the terms of the 2003 Act. What I'm doing in the appeal process here is not giving owners an opportunity to say, no, I don't think the work should be done, or B, I don't think it should be apportioned that way. It's purely a technical issue about, for example, if the owner was transferred in good faith at market value, then there could be a technical opportunity for them to appeal. I'm not expecting this to be used very often. I do understand the concerns that the government has, and we are prepared to look at this again. I would go back to my earlier points. The advice I was given that you normally have to have some element of the European Convention of Human Rights on any new legislation which doesn't give people a right of appeal. So I would reassure local authorities I would not see this as a viable delaying tactic, because it cannot be used to argue about the need for the work or the apportionment. That will be done at a previous stage under the Dangerous Buildings Order.
Okay. Just to follow up on that, I mean, that answers that, but do you think there's an expectation out there? I mean, around communities, there is, I think, concerns that councils don't seem to have the powers to be able to act in terms of what's described as derelict buildings, buildings that blight local communities. And I think my own constituency, Cowdenbeath High Street, where we have a former hotel that was set on fire, sits there really quite derelict, horrible looking. It's the main entrance to the town. And the answer that the council tends to give is that, well, it's not unsafe. And I know that this bill and the Community Empowerment Bill going through has been referred to time and time again in local papers as something that will allow councils to actually address that. And I suppose the concern, if you're listening to what's said this morning, is perhaps not. Or do you think that local authorities just simply have been reluctant to take that next step unless they absolutely had to because it was difficult to recover the money?
Well, I think that's a very good point. And again, I've spoken to that. Your view reflects what I'm getting from local authorities across the country and the various conversations I've had recently. If you're saying to me, is there a gap in the market for legislation sort of scenarios you paint? Probably there is. When I've asked local authorities, what do you do then with the derelict building that's not dangerous, that's maybe orphaned ownership, you can't determine the owner, where you would maybe want to have that as affordable housing? They tell me, as you'll know, that there is some powers under planning legislation with compulsory purchase, but there has to be a dedicated plan in place for that. I think there probably is some gaps. And I wouldn't want to over-egg the perhaps extra work the councils may do if they get a charging order. I do, however, feel that for high-level defective and lower-level dangerous, where there is a sort of blurred area about whether councils should act or not, I think councils would be more encouraged to act in the future because they will have confidence, if it's a charging order, that they will get the money back. But I did say earlier, you wouldn't use the charging order in every situation. So my expectation, if this goes through in the future, is that the amount of outstanding debt in the future that councils have, the profile of that will be reduced. And I think on the margins, you probably will see councils carrying out more work on the boundary between high defective and lower end dangerous work. So that's my prediction on speaking to officials across the country. But I would stress to the committee, I'm not suggesting that every time a slate falls off a roof or a road pipe is broken, that suddenly councils have a magic bullet to go and do the work. They have clear financial issues and will probably not get involved in that type of work, but they will definitely take a much more positive view on dealing with clear, straightforward, dangerous building work.
Yes, it just occurred to me listening to Alec Rowley's quite reasonable point about the hotel in Cowdenbeath. Would one of the ways in which an unsafe building could be dealt with is to actually demolish it? And therefore, in certain circumstances, that could actually be a rather unhelpful outcome, but did make something safe, because I think we would probably all be more interested in it being moved towards a positive reinstatement of its previous condition rather than demolition, which might make it safe.
No, that's a good point. In fact, in my consultation at the last session, I published a picture from, I think it was North Ayrshire, about a disco that had gone on fire and completely burned down, and what was left was dangerous. And North Ayrshire demolished the building, and I think it was around between 200 and 300,000. Unfortunately, the owner disappeared, and I understand now there's a disco in Glasgow, allegedly, I should say. And the council were out of pocket. They could not get that funds back. So in some occasions, building control will demolish. But my wider issue, and I've got examples of my own patch, the old youth hostel near the castle in Inverness, is probably not dangerous, but is really unsightly. And the downside, of course, is that the neighbours' property values goes downhill. And the other point I haven't pushed, Convener, perhaps at this point I can just insert into the record, is most local authorities tell me that they use the private sector to do their dangerous building work. I think Midlothian said last week it was their DLO that they use. Obviously, if there is an increase in any work carried out, that will be a boost to the construction sector across Scotland, which I'm sure we all welcome as well. But in demolition, in answer to the question, does happen, can be very, very expensive, but at least then leaves opportunities in orphan ownership for perhaps new developments such as affordable housing to be built in place of the scarred building that was there before.
Austin, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Stewart. The issues that I think we've covered in great detail, but in your opening statements you made a couple of comments I'd like to just examine further. And one of them was the issue about the number of dangerous and defective buildings that have coming through. You mentioned a figure of 402, rising to 992. In relation to those figures, are they figures from local authorities that you've gathered? And have you had any indication what the average cost in relation to these, the carrying out the works to make those buildings safe? Because last week, as you heard in evidence, we got the average figure of £3,000 from local authorities, but we've just heard, you mentioned a figure of over £200,000 to make good a dangerous building in North Ayrshire. So what is your experience of the average cost in relation to these charges?
Thank you for the question, Mr Wilson. In answer to the first part of the question, the figures I quoted were through a parliamentary question that I lodged, and I think it's the most up-to-date position that we had. So these are actual real-life figures. I actually have the breakdown per local authority, and if the convener was agreeable, I don't think the committee have that information. I'm happy to send. Sorry, it's in the explanatory notes. I apologise. So the information is available to the committee. Your point about cost is a very good one. That's obviously it's not a question I can answer specifically because it obviously varies from each area. I think it was Midlothian speaker you had last week was telling me that what they do is they have a very clear risk assessment to any dangerous building. So, for example, they will go in and initially just do the basic work, like the boarding up the windows, make sure things aren't falling off the roof, before they have further discussions with the owner, if the owner can be found, about what further work is required. Because quite rightly, along with their dangerous building responsibility, they have responsibility to taxpayers to make sure they're not spending excessive funds that they cannot get back. So there's a big issue around that. And they were telling me the tragic story of how they boarded up upstairs windows in a house in Dalkeith, I think it was, and 3 young children got in and started a fire in the house and unfortunately died because of that. So now what they're advising is they don't board up first floor windows to allow a form of escape. So there's health and safety, legal and financial responsibilities on councils. So it varies towards the situation, but I think most local authorities will take that approach, which you do the minimum until you negotiate with the owner. Most authorities will hope the owner will pay. The nightmare situation is if it's very dangerous work on a huge building where you can't trace the owner and you have to make the building safe. That's where you can incur huge costs like the one in North Ayrshire. So that's what's adding to the burden of local authorities not getting their nearly £4 million outstanding currently across Scotland.
Just to go to that £4 million, 3.9 million, I think you said in earlier evidence, oral evidence, and that was extrapolated from 8 local authorities calculating that throughout Scotland. Could you put that into perspective in terms of the overall charges that are being laid by local authorities against owners of buildings? As a percentage, or is that, where does that 3.9 million come into the equation?
I don't know if Claire wants to come into that point.
Yeah, the figure came from the Scottish Government's commissioned research report, and there are gaps in the figures about the local authorities that were included in the project. So it's difficult to, as I say, it's extrapolated from these 8 local authorities up to 32. So that I wouldn't say it was a sound basis to come up with an average figure.
It's just that you've used that figure in evidence, and it's just that our role is to examine that evidence that's provided to us. And part of it, as I said, the second part of my question was, how does that compare with the overall regime in terms of recovery of costs incurred by local authorities in making good, dangerous and defective buildings?
Neil?
I'm not sure I can really add anything on that. It's really a question about statistical information to a certain extent. I don't know whether we can.
All the information that is available in the public domain at the moment is the Scottish Government's own commissioned research report, or the parliamentary questions and the number of notices. But we don't have financial figures that are associated to that. It's more numbers rather than the actual.
But in answer to be helpful to the member, I mean, I'm happy to put a further parliamentary question down asking what the actual costs per local authority are, because that's not figures in the public domain. And again, I can write to the convener with that information, Mr Wilson.
Yeah, it's just that in terms of doing some calculations myself and based on the evidence we've heard this morning, the 992 empty buildings that need to be made good, based on the average cost we heard last week from local authorities of £3,000, works out at just under £3 million. But the figure that you quoted earlier was £3.9 million in unrecovered costs.
Yeah.
And it's really just trying to put those into context in relation to the bill that's proposed. But the next question, Convener, would be around the comment made by Mr Stewart earlier about the charging orders may not be appropriate in all circumstances. Could you expand on what circumstances they may not be appropriate?
Certainly, and I think I've touched on it to answer to Mr Buchanan, is that the key partnership must be building control officers making a joint decision with their legal teams of each local authorities about where it's useful to use a charging order. So where would you not use a charging order? Where there's an unclear title would be the first one. The other one, and you can get this, I think, in searches, you can, if the building, if there was negative equity in the building, that is possible, I think, Mr Ross, to determine that in terms of you would know what the outstanding security was and you could work out the value of the property, obviously, through local council officials. So these would be a couple of examples of where I would recommend you won't use a charging order. I don't know if Mr Ross wants to say anything further.
Yes, I mean, I think also the comment touches on the fact that, and really just to emphasise that the whether or not a charging order would be used would be at the discretion of the local authority. I think in part the member is emphasising that you know whether it's a discretionary power to use a charging order, and as has been said, that will be a judgment taking account of all relevant factors, and it will have involved the relevant officials in looking at a number of factors as to whether a charging order is the appropriate course in that particular situation. I'm not sure I can really expand beyond that.
I think the key asset, Mr Wilson, is the fact that it's very cheap to register. You don't go to court. You go to the land registry. It's £50 to have that, and you have a hold until it's paid off on the title of the building. So most new owners would not want a cluttered title. In other words, they would want to ensure that whatever debt was cleared. And for low-income owners, and we all have examples in our own constituencies of perhaps elderly men and women whose family have left or staying in big houses but have a very low income. In these circumstances, charging orders might be quite a good way forward. Remember, it's not just an imposition. It may well be a negotiation with the owner that that's an appropriate route. So I think that's the great strength. And in most cases, I mean, the title's pretty clear. I think I'm right saying, Mr Ross, it's not. You're only talking about a marginal call. So on most occasions, I would have said a charging order is a great route forward. And we all know the problems with conventional cost recovery. It's expensive and doesn't always achieve the goal of getting funds back to local authorities.
Convener, that takes me up to my next question, is that, no, it's fine to say that decisions about charging orders will be taken by legal and building control officers. What I would ask is, in terms of your investigation leading up to the presentation of the bill, did you consider what discussions council officers would engage in with owners of buildings? Because, as I said, and I would hope that when these charging orders are being imposed, that the officers involved have actually exhausted the discussions, any possible discussions with owners.
I think that's
just applying a charging order.
No, I think Mr Wilson makes a very good point. I would stress that the responsibility for repairing and making buildings safer are the owners. On most occasions, in all local authorities in Scotland, it's the owners that will pay any funds up front to the local council. What they tell me across Scotland, I met the Chief Executive of Glasgow just recently, and his officers were telling me that negotiations, part of the parcel, before you even think of any other cost control, you would negotiate a repayment. If that can be done on a voluntary basis, you don't go near courts or don't go near charging orders. You just use negotiation to get that funds back. I mean, it's in the council's interest to do that. I would also hope, Mr Wilson's right to say this, that a charging order would be part of the negotiation as well. It's always better taking the owner with the council rather than just an imposition.
Thank you very much, Mr Stewart.
Supplementary, Stuart Stevenson.
The member made reference obliquely to equity release that elderly owners of large properties might indulge in, which would lead to a security being attached to the property. But given that these owners are essentially low on income, do the provisions of his bill or the practical operations mean that the point at which the charging order or any debt to the council that arises can be deferred until the death of the owner, as would be the case with equity release schemes?
Well, just to be totally clear, I wasn't talking about formal equity release schemes, which, no, I was using an analogy that where someone stayed in a large house, was elderly and had a low income, which we all know examples of, a charging order is useful because it makes sure the property is then safe, which is in the owner's interest, it's in the neighbour's interest, it's in the council's interest. And it may be then, on these occasions, where the local authority has some more discretion over the period of the charging order, which I'm hoping to do, that they could then, what they'd then do is get an appropriate period of the charging order. Normally, on the death of the owner, you would expect the outstanding debt to be cleared. Even if, for example, it was...
And I just intervene, we can cut to the chase. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure that we could start the charge at a distant date. It didn't have to start at once. That was all I was really after.
Could I ask perhaps Mr Ross to answer the technical side, but the point I just want to put in the record as well, if the elderly person dies and it's passed on to a son or daughter, they are still responsible because they have the title of the building. You don't need to do anything else because it's a hold on the title of the building. Yep.
Yes, you ask a technical point. It would be a matter for the local authority to determine the point at which it would actually proceed to formally register the charge.
That's sufficient. Thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener. Mr Stewart, could I ask that this used to be a tool that used to sit in the toolbox, it was removed. Could I ask your view on as to why you think that that was removed, and had there been any negative issues or concerns?
I think that's a very good point. I think this is one of life's great mysteries. I've spent a lot of time and effort talking to Spice, to ex-ministers, to Nebu and others to see why this excellent tool was taken out 2002/3. There was some suggestion there might have been European legislation coming in which might have impacted, but none subsequently came. I think we have to say that it was an error, and I'm not blaming anybody or any political party, that's just the way it was. I mean, at the very least, what I'm doing then is making good a mistake that was made in 2002/3. As you know, it worked very well from 1959 to 2002. All parties supported it. I'm not claiming it was perfect, but it was a good extra tool in the toolbox. So it was an error, and if someone can tell me the explanation, I'll be very grateful, because I've come to zero in terms of getting intelligence on that.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr Stewart, can I thank you very much for your evidence today? Oh, beg your pardon, Mr MacDonald. Sorry, I didn't see you indicating.
I hadn't. It's just a couple of questions, Convener. The first one was just around, we've spent a lot of time during the course of our evidence talking about private ownership of properties. Have you encountered any problems or potential problems where a property may be in the ownership of, for example, another council department, i.e. the education department in relation to a derelict school building, or another public body? Because obviously we're talking about local authorities recouping costs, but if they're recouping costs from internally, have you encountered any difficulties that may be encountered in that respect?
Well, I think that's a good point, Mr. I haven't actually considered the prospects that could be another local authority department. But I suppose the fundamental is, if it's dangerous and defective buildings, the local authority can't get its funds back. It can use a charging order to anybody, as long as there's a clear title. So, and that might cause some local embarrassment if it's another public body. But the good thing is they know they're getting their funds back, because it's not, I know, you all know examples where public bodies take each other to court. I've got some local examples in my area about that. It seems daft from a taxpayer's point of view, because they're incurring lots of legal costs doing this. But there's no debarment to it, whether it's owned by a public body or another local authority department, whatever. As long as there's a title, it's competent. I think Mr Ross would. I don't know if you have any to add on that, Mr.
I don't think so. And clearly, it couldn't take action against itself. But beyond that, a charging order would be an option.
That's fair. I think it was just important to get that on the record, because we have talked a lot about private ownership. The second point was around the point that you raised at the last evidence session around an element of retrospective looking at the bill. Have you looked any further at the detail of that? Because obviously there are complexities which could arise if you try and apply a charging order retrospectively, particularly in areas where ownership may have changed hands on repeated occasion.
Well, clearly I understand that local authorities are quite keen generally in going back in time, because the level of debt that Mr Wilson pointed out, it was quite clear it would be a good tool for them to go back in time to do it. I mean, the general advice I've taken is that it's not normal to backdate legislation, and again there's ECHR issues. So the legal advice I've been given is that we're best not doing that, and the bill, if it goes through, will be effective 6 months after royal assent. I do pick up what the Minister said, and again, I'm obviously happy to discuss some of these points with, with the Scottish Government team. But I think also last week, I don't think the witnesses were very keen in retrospectivity. So my position of taking the bill is not to go back in time. But unless there's, if I'm getting a very compelling amendment, as always, I'll keep my options open. But I was given legal advice that there may be some breaches there in terms of human rights.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. You said that you would write to the committee and clarify a couple of matters.
Yes.
I have to say to you, if you could do so by the end of the week, we would be grateful, because obviously there are processes that need to be gone through here. Can I suspend the meeting for just a couple of minutes to allow the witnesses to leave? Thank you. We now move on to item 3, which is consideration of 3 negative instruments. The Local Government Pension Scheme Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland Regulations 2014, SSI 2014/23, the Non-Domestic Rate Scotland Order 2014, SSI 2014/28, and the Non-Domestic Rates Levying Scotland Regulations 2014, SSI 2014/30. Members have a paper from the Clerk setting out the purpose of the instruments. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered these instruments and did not have any comments to make. Do members have any comments to make on any of these instruments? Mr Stevenson.
Can I just take the opportunity, Convener, to very much welcome the continuation of the business bonus, which is so valuable to many of our smaller businesses across Scotland, that is encompassed in the Non-Domestic Rate Order 2014, SSI 2014/28.
Thank you very much. Are we agreed not to make any recommendation to the Parliament on any of these instruments? Thank you very much. We now move into private session, and I suspend.